Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the August 14, 2019 edition of Space News, which is our 100th episode. This is Peter Aylward. I'm joined with the full crew here, Michael Abdullah, Angela Dugazia and Tina Stagg, all from the Space Association. So let's get straight into some space news from Australia, which is what we love to do. NASA inspects proposed Northern Territory Space Base. NASA has conducted a site inspection of the area of Northern Territory from which it plans to launch a series of sounding rockets. Scientists Todd Barber and Tom Nolan from NASA's JPL in California recently visited the proposed launch site outside of Nullanby in northeastern Arnhem Land. Space company Equatorial Launch Australia has named this the Galcoola launch site, the Aboriginal name for the locality. NASA plans to launch at least 3 suborbital sounding rockets from there next year. As yet, there is no launch infrastructure on the site. The NASA scientists liken the local red dirt landscape to their Mars landscape mock-up at JPL. However, for launch, the sounding rockets, extensive infrastructure isn't necessary. But the involvement of NASA has helped move the Space Centre's plans into reality. While NASA scientists visited the proposed ELA launch site, the main purpose of their visit was educational, to talk to local high school students about the booming space sector. And over to New Zealand, Rocket Lab announced last week that it will attempt to recover and reuse the first stage of its Electron rockets. That concept sounds familiar. The company has started work to instrument and modify Electron first stages so they can survive re-entry at hypersonic speeds, with the ultimate goal of having stages caught in mid-air by a helicopter so they can be easily refurbished and launched again. Reusing the first stage will allow Rocket Lab to increase its launch rate without having to build more rockets. This is part of a strategy to compete in the burgeoning small sat market, which involves a number of upcoming players such as Virgin Orbit, as well as existing player like SpaceX, which has begun to offer rideshare on its Falcon 9 rockets. And over to Angelo.
Thanks, Pete. To US space policy news. The chairman of the Senate Budget Committee said he's troubled by cost and schedule problems with NASA programs. In a letter recently to NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, Senator Mike Enzi, a Republican from Wyoming, said delays and cost overruns put at risk vital NASA missions and taxpayers' dollars. He singled out the James Webb Telescope and, you guessed it, Space Launch System as programs with serious issues. Bridenstine responded to Enzi, assuring the senator that he is working to change this culture of cost and schedule problems, and agreed to provide a detailed response to Enzi's questions later this month. Okay, Tina, moving to you.
Thanks, Angelo, and good evening, space fans. Cygnus cargo spacecraft departed from the International Space Station last week. The station's robotic arm released the NG-11 Cygnus spacecraft, also called the SS Roger Chaffee, last week. Northrop Grumman plans to keep the Cygnus in orbit for at least several months, deploying CubeSats and performing experiments before re-entering. The next Cygnus mission is scheduled for launch in October. To NASA's SLS and Orion program, NASA is soliciting proposals for CubeSats to fly on the second SLS mission. NASA said last week it was planning to fly CubeSats on Artemis 2, the second flight of the SLS, tentatively scheduled for 2022. NASA will accept proposals for 6U and 12U CubeSats, specifically those that address what NASA calls strategic knowledge gaps regarding robotic or human exploration of the Moon or Mars. NASA is flying 13 CubeSats on the first SLS mission, launching no later than late 2020, but more likely in 2021. And over to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. And let's look at some US Air Force news. The Air Force's X-37B has now been in orbit for 700 days on its latest mission. The spaceplane, launched in September 2017, on its fifth mission, details of which remain largely under wraps. The previous X-37B mission remained in orbit for 718 days, so perhaps we're coming up to a deorbit. And back to you, Tina.
Thanks, Michael. To Germany. A German university has successfully demonstrated electric thrusters on a 1U CubeSat. The University Wurzburg Experimental Satellite 4, launched last December, used 4 160-gram Morpheus nanofield effect electric propulsion, or NanoFEEP thrusters, to speed up its rotation rate in a test in May. The thrusters were developed by Morpheus Space, a spin-off of the Institute of Aerospace Engineering of Technical University Dresden. Back to Mike.
Thank you, Tina. Let's look at China. Chang'e 4's lunar rover has now driven 271 metres on the surface of the moon since landing in January. The lander and rover went into sleep mode last week for the 2-week lunar night, after the Yutu-2 rover travelled more than 30 metres in the latest lunar day of activities. The rover's radar instrument was reportedly providing very interesting data about the lunar subsurface that is awaiting publication. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Mike. NOAA plans to conduct technology demonstrations and Pathfinder projects as it prepares to update its Earth observation constellations. NOAA plans to release one broad agency announcement in September for low Earth orbit instruments and mission concepts, and another focused on geostationary orbit. The effort will build upon the NOAA Satellite Observing System Architecture Study, an extensive quantitative analysis completed in 2017 aimed at creating a capable, affordable and resilient space-based architecture. Angelo.
Now to commercial SpaceX news. SpaceX and Arianespace separately announced new dedicated rideshare launch services for small sats last week. SpaceX announced it was starting its own dedicated rideshare program to launch spacecraft to sun-synchronous orbit, with missions roughly once a year starting in late 2020 or early 21. SpaceX says it can launch a 150-kilogram small sat on those missions for about $2.25 million if a contract is signed at least a year in advance. Arianespace's Go-1 mission, scheduled for launch in 2022 on an Ariane 6, will carry multiple payloads directly into geostationary orbit. Arianespace says it believes there is significant demand for the service, particularly given the growing interest in the small geo satellites. As we said earlier, this is part of the jockeying for position in the very lucrative and competitive small sat market. SpaceX has disclosed new details about its plans to conduct Starship Super Heavy launches from Florida. An environmental assessment report released recently describes how SpaceX proposes to make modifications to Launch Complex 39A to support launches of the next generation reusable rocket, including the construction of a new launch mount near the existing one used for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches. The Super Heavy booster would land on a ship in the Atlantic, while the Starship upper stage would land at the company's landing zone 1 at Cape Canaveral initially, with plans for it to eventually land on Pad 39A. SpaceX expects the site to support 24 such launches a year, but the report didn't state when those launches would begin. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk said that he will give a progress update on the development of Starship on August 24th at the company's South Texas test site. Now to Blue Origin. Blue Origin conducted a full-power test of its BE-4 engine recently. The company disclosed few details about the test at its West Texas test site. The company has been gradually progressing towards full power on the engine, which is designed to produce 550,000 pounds force of thrust. The engine will be used on both Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket and ULA's Vulcan, both scheduled to make first launches in 2021.
And moving to Virgin Orbit. As Virgin Orbit prepares for its first Launcher 1 mission, the company has a long-term vision of responsive launch. At a conference last week, a company official outlined a responsive launch enterprise that makes use of the company's air launch system to quickly deploy small satellites. Such a system could launch an entire constellation within several hours, using multiple aircraft flying from multiple spaceports. The company emphasised this was a long-term vision and didn't say how long it would take to implement it or the cost. Moving to Vector Space Systems, the US Air Force awarded a launch contract to small launch vehicle developer Vector last week. The $3.4 million contract from the Air Force Rocket Systems Launch Program Office is to lift experimental CubeSats to low Earth orbit on a mission called Aslon 45. That launch was to take place in 2021 from Wallops Island in Virginia. Vector is developing 2 small launch vehicles but has yet to attempt an orbital launch. Not long after that award, rumours in social media of financial issues at Vector Launch appeared to be true, according to a statement from a company spokesperson. This came the same day its CEO was abruptly no longer with the company. And back to you, Tina.
Israel's Bereshit spacecraft that crash-landed on the moon in April carried a previously unknown and unusual payload, tardigrades. The microscopic organisms, known as water bears, were part of a payload included on the lander by the Arch Mission Foundation that also included a lunar library of information as well as DNA samples. Nova Spivak, founder of the Arch Mission Foundation, speculated that the lunar library may be the only thing that survived the lander's impact on the lunar surface, and that the tardigrades, which can survive extreme environments on the Earth, might one day be revived. However, scientists who study tardigrades say the creatures are unlikely to survive the harsh environment on the moon, including ultraviolet light and cosmic rays, especially after a high-velocity impact. "I think the moon's pretty safe from a tardigrade invasion," said one scientist. And to Angelo.
There's no sign of progress in ending a protest that has closed off access to observatories on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Hundreds of protesters continue to block the road leading to the mountain's summit to prevent construction of the 30-metre telescope from starting. They fear the observatory will disturb what native Hawaiians consider a sacred location. A wide majority of Hawaiians, including native Hawaiians, do support the building of the 30-metre telescope. The protests have closed the other observatories on the mountain since mid-July. Okay, Peter.
All right, just wrapping up this week. Earth's atmosphere, long the bane of astronomers, could be turned into a lens for a space telescope. A concept proposed in a paper by astronomer David Kipping of Columbia University suggests that a space telescope with a mirror 1 metre across placed beyond the orbit of the moon could use the ring of the Earth's atmosphere as seen from that location as a lens, focusing light from more distant objects. Such a telescope system would not produce stable images, but could detect much fainter objects. Other astronomers who read the proposal said that they were impressed by the concept, but more study was needed to see if it was really feasible. And finally this week, a small body may have struck Jupiter. An amateur astronomer in Texas observed Jupiter last week, captured a flash in the planet's southern hemisphere, near the equator. Astronomers are planning observation to look for any dark scar left in the atmosphere by the impact. And that's it for this week, and once again it's our 100th episode. Thank you everybody for being involved, and thanks Andrew for letting us in. Tina, Angelo, Mike, it's been great. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, Andrew.